Hello, welcome to the channel Why Stories. Enjoy watching.
Fleeing from her husband and mother-in-law, a pregnant woman bought a dilapidated house in the wilderness. But after discovering a hidden hole in the wall, the already dark and eerie autumn night thickened with black storm clouds, and the moonlight barely illuminated the surroundings. In this part of a small and rather poor town, the streetlights had long been smashed by various not-so-nice kids, who at that time were around 19 years old, and now were possibly nearing 25. In short, the town was so neglected by the local administration that the residents had no choice but to rely on themselves. Irene Macias, who was about to turn 28 in just a month, was walking slowly toward the train station, which was only about 300 meters away. Nevertheless, the overgrown lawns in front of the houses in the town's residential area created a very frightening and uneasy feeling of anxiety. For from the bushy shrubs, from the trees, between which piles of various trash had accumulated over time on the dry grass, anyone could be hiding. There were plenty of abandoned buildings here, so the type of people who might be on the streets at such a late hour would hardly be friendly to a young, beautiful girl. On her weak female shoulders, Irene carried a huge duffel bag with her belongings. It was indeed enormous, holding at least 90 liters. It contained all her personal possessions, so to speak, that she had managed to acquire by the age of 28. The dark night thickened the clouds in the sky even more. The ticket for the train, which was supposed to take Irene away from this cursed place in just an hour and a half, was booked for 10:21 p.m. local time, and at 10:15 p.m., according to the weather forecast, there was expected to be an incredible downpour with thunder and possibly severe hail. Irene hoped that she might miraculously find some kind of shelter at the station, though as far as she remembered, the local train station was in such a terrible state that any shelter or canopy would be about the best she could hope for. The enormous heavy bag, which she had to support from underneath, kept sliding down her slippery autumn coat. At one point, the bag nearly fell to the ground, but Irene managed to catch it just in time by bending sharply. She immediately felt a sharp pain in her back, but gritted her teeth against the pain and waited a few seconds until it subsided before continuing her walk toward the station. The ticket was in the inner pocket of her jacket, along with her documents and a small amount of money, enough to at least buy herself something to eat. The situation the young girl found herself in would move even the most callous and hardened person, someone indifferent to compassion and sympathy. Even those who simply cannot feel such emotions would, in some way, experience an unpleasant twinge in their heart, or perhaps even a chill running down their spine, if they only knew what the unfortunate girl had gone through, as she hurried to leave this city behind. But she did not give up. Since childhood, her father, who had passed away several years ago, along with her mother, had taught little Irene to endure all the hardships and trials of life with resilience. He had said that surrender was not an option, no matter how painful or lonely it might be. One had to keep moving forward, and even if one fell, they should get up as long as they had the strength. Irene had carried these words with her throughout her life, even though she hadn't lived all that many years yet. Somewhere to the right, the clatter of wheels on rails was heard. Those very sounds of a train, which Irene had only dreamed of until recently, were finally so close, so near, that Irene couldn't help but smile as she imagined herself riding the train, leaving this place behind, gazing out the window, and listening to some melancholic playlist through ordinary white-wired headphones that kept slipping out of her ears. This scene was pure happiness for her at that moment. Of course, the girl couldn't help but think about what was supposed to happen next according to her plan. The next chapter was meant to be a new life, free of Luis and his obnoxious mother, for whom Irene, if she felt anything at all, felt only hatred. Everything she had lived through in the past few years would somehow fade from memory, making way for new experiences that, many years later, she would look back on with nostalgia while sitting in retirement, telling someone how she had started her life from scratch. And if anyone asked her what her old life was like, she would pause for a few seconds and then, with a kind smile, say, "I don't remember." And she hoped she truly wouldn't. It would be quite fortuitous if she were to accidentally fall, landing awkwardly, and then wake up in a hospital where she discovered she had lost her memory. And no memories could ever be recovered. That was the second thing she truly wished for at that moment. Meanwhile, Irene had almost reached the train station. As she entered the station area, she found herself immediately on the platform. The wind blew in her face as she was in an open space. She didn't want to go inside the station building, as it was quite warm compared to the street, and Irene suspected that if she relaxed on a bench, she might fall asleep and miss her train, with no one around to wake her up at the right time. So, after looking around and not finding any benches or shelters, she decided to stand for an hour and a half and wait for her train. To pass the time more quickly, she took out her headphones from her pocket, which she had been reluctant to use until now because she was walking through a less than safe area and needed to listen for any sounds to feel somewhat secure. She plugged them into her phone and played a random playlist. And here's sad music too, she thought wistfully but didn't switch it. Lately, she had been drawn to listening to sad music, and her recent playlists had contained only that. Standing at the station, and although frowning, enjoying the cold autumn wind blowing directly into her face, Irene didn't notice how the hour and a half flew by. A song came on the playlist that she couldn't listen to due to her aversion to the artist. As she pulled out her phone to skip it, she saw that the time was approaching 10:15 p.m. Looking up at the sky, she saw that the clouds above the station had gathered so densely and closely together that it seemed like the rain was about to pour down, washing away everything in sight and leaving only an empty space where the old, time-worn train station stood. Looking around again, Irene still couldn't find any shelter or canopy where she could take cover. So, she decided to go inside the station building. Perhaps there would be some people there, as there was no one on the platform. The silence and emptiness, with a young, vulnerable girl in the midst of it all, were overwhelming. But despite her vulnerability, she had so much will to live that she was willing to leave the city where she had spent her whole life to start anew. Yet inside the building, there was no one either. Only a solitary ticket agent, sitting in a small room visible only through glass covered with old, rusty bars, was silently working on a crossword puzzle. Irene, looking around and realizing that she was the only one there, quietly walked to the first bench she saw. Her footsteps echoed throughout the hall, and the ticket agent, hearing this, was forced to pay attention to the entering girl. "Where are you headed?" she called through a small opening in the window, adjusting the thick glasses on her face. "Are you here for a ticket?" "I bought my ticket a couple of days ago," Irene replied. "My train is in, 11 minutes. The ticket agent was surprised. Leaning closer to the window, she folded her hands on the sill and looked at Irene with a kind of interest. Then, smiling with the corners of her mouth, she said, "Interesting, young lady, are you sure you're not mistaken? Maybe you bought a ticket for a different train and got confused?" "Why do you think that?" Irene asked, and she quickly unfastened her jacket to retrieve her ticket, just to confirm that she was going where she needed to. "I see you're the only one traveling on this train," squinted the elderly ticket agent with a large protruding mole near her nose and lips as wrinkled as tree bark. "No one else has bought tickets. Do you like to travel alone?" The ticket agent's company started to irritate Irene. The old woman, who probably should have been retired a long time ago, judging by her appearance, was too intrusive and clearly overstepping her bounds. Irene had no intention of justifying herself or explaining why she had chosen this particular train, direction, or time. Circumstances had shaped her choices, and an unfamiliar elderly woman should not be concerned with them. That she was the only one boarding the train at this station was definitely not her problem. "I need to go to the destination of this train," Irene replied, still relatively calmly, though a slight note of sharpness crept into her tone. "As for why no one else is going there, I don't know." The ticket agent shook her head, then stepped away from the window, returned to her chair or stool, made a soft clicking noise with her lips, and continued silently examining her old-fashioned crossword puzzle. Irene watched the ticket agent for a few more seconds, expecting her to say something else, but the old woman had now completely disengaged from the conversation. Irene took out her phone to check the time again. It was 10:15 p.m. The door was closed, but it had a cutout window through which she could clearly see raindrops. However, the storm hadn't started yet. They lied here too, the girl thought, and she pulled up the weather forecast online. But before she could type her search query, she heard the sounds of an approaching train again. The wheels of the train clattered on the rails. With excitement in her eyes, Irene hurried to turn off her phone, lift the heavy bag she had placed beside her on the bench back onto her shoulder, and leave the building. "Safe travels," the ticket agent called out as a farewell. "Not even going to check my ticket?" Irene asked, surprised, turning to the elderly woman who was still absorbed in her crossword puzzle with the same impassive expression. "I trust you," the old woman nodded. "Go ahead." Without replying, Irene hurried out of the station building. It was still not raining outside, but the clouds seemed to have darkened even more in the few minutes she had spent inside. The train stopped at the platform, and its doors opened. Again, looking around, Irene saw no one else. Then, scanning the train windows, she counted only a few people who would be traveling with her. Delighted that she wouldn't be alone in the unfamiliar train, she boarded, took the first seat she found most comfortable, and placed her bag on the seat next to it. The headphones that had been hanging under her coat now rested on her chest. Ensuring she hadn't left anything behind, she pressed her cheek to the window and plugged the headphones into her ears. Once again, the melancholic music played, causing tears to begin flowing from her eyes and trickling down her cheeks. But there were no more tears left to fall. Ahead on the horizon was an entirely new life. Irene had already decided that nothing should stop her from starting anew, ensuring that no smudge from the previous page she was now turning would reappear. A few minutes later, the train doors closed, and raindrops began to appear on the window. Even such a small detail as the timing of the rain seemed to play in Irene's favor. She had learned to find signs from above in these small details. And when she realized that the rain had started just as she was leaving, she was reassured that her new life would be better, excellent even, certainly much better than here, in this place. The lights in the train carriage went out, creating a very good atmosphere for falling asleep. The journey was going to be long because Irene was traveling far from here, from the center of the country. She was heading towards the mountains, where a lot of snow falls, and she planned to settle somewhere near Soria. The distance wasn't very great, and Irene was fortunate that there were trains running on this route. She didn't want to travel in a couchette, she preferred the comfort and convenience of a seat in the train. Then, as soon as the train started moving, Irene suddenly realized that she actually wanted that one small smudge she had left on the previous page of her life to be duplicated in her new one. This small smudge, which she didn't yet know, was growing inside her. After all, starting a new life without her now ex-husband and his annoying mother, she couldn't leave behind an innocent child, even if it had the least ideal biological father. If necessary, Irene was ready to raise the child on her own. That evening, Irene had returned from work quite late. In one of the large supermarket chains that was widespread across the country and had a colossal customer base, where Irene also worked, her replacement for the night shift was delayed by almost an hour and a half. Of course, the girl had a heated argument with him because she needed to get home as soon as possible. But given the circumstances, and after finding out the reasons for her colleague's delay, she was forced to be understanding. Returning home in the dark, when the clock had already passed midnight, Irene could only think about whether Luis was asleep or not. If he was asleep, then she had nothing to fear. But if he was still awake, sitting in the kitchen and shaking with nerves and stress he essentially brought on himself, waiting for her to come home, then she would face a major confrontation. Luis was the kind of person who kept all his emotions, mostly consisting of anger, bottled up until the last moment. He sometimes called and started arguments over the phone, but usually waited until his wife came home before beginning to hash things out. But the worst possible scenario would be if Luis's mother was also waiting at home for Irene's return. Her name was Senora Alida. She was 59 years old and a very unpleasant woman. Irene had realized this back when she was still in love with Luis, shortly after they got married. At the wedding, the future mother-in-law showed her worst side, starting with criticizing her daughter-in-law's appearance. Although she did it as delicately as possible, Senora Alita essentially scolded Irene for her makeup, which actually suited her very well and enhanced her already beautiful appearance. Senora Alita also remarked that the dress Irene had chosen did not fit her well. Back then, Irene tried to overlook this, convincing herself that the mother-in-law was simply in a bad mood that day. But on that very day, their wedding day, August 11th, 6 years ago, while Senora Alita had just criticized her nearly daughter-in-law, she praised her son's appearance so much that if his smile could stretch from ear to ear and meet at the back of his head, it surely would have from such compliments. And now, if Senora Alita wasn't asleep with her beloved son, waiting for the return of her hated daughter-in-law, then tonight there would be more than just a scandal at their home. It would be something far beyond a typical argument. That night, just as on the night Irene left that cursed place, the clouds were gathering in the sky. The wind grew stronger with each gust, and the girl's long hair became increasingly disheveled. As she approached the house, each step made her heart pound harder. Her legs seemed to want to turn her body 180 degrees and run as far away as possible to escape this nightmare. As Irene got closer to her home, she noticed that the kitchen light was on. She sighed heavily, trying to muster the strength and patience to endure this hell once more, presented to her in the guise of people who called themselves her family. People who were supposed to support her and prevent her from collapsing mentally, but instead pushed her into a pit of depression and constant stress, nervous breakdowns, and other unpleasant things. Opening the gate and entering the yard, Irene first glanced toward the doghouse near the entrance to the property. In the old, peeling doghouse that Luis had built a couple of years ago from damp boards, their dog Rocky lived. To his own misfortune, Rocky had found his way to them. Until this moment, Irene hadn't realized that dogs could also choose their owners. Rocky clearly hadn't chosen the best ones, and Irene felt very sorry for him. Rocky lay in his doghouse, resting his dirty face on his paws, which reflected nothing but despair but would light up with hope whenever he saw Irene. The girl felt ashamed that she couldn't help the poor animal. What to say, if she couldn't even help herself? Locking the gate, Irene steeled herself and took a step toward the house. After walking a few meters, she began to berate herself for not checking Rocky's food bowl earlier. If she went back now to check, her husband, who was almost certainly watching her from the kitchen window that faced the yard, would think she was scared and decided to leave, avoiding the unpleasant conversation. Once again mentally sympathizing with the dog, she continued toward the door. Standing before the door, which was reached by several concrete steps, Irene, who had never believed in God, felt an urge to make the sign of the cross. Thoughts raced through her mind at lightning speed. She tried to anticipate every possible scenario in the few seconds she had. In her imagination, she could respond to her husband's rudeness with her own rudeness, slap him, and leave without saying goodbye. Such fantasies gave her a false sense of hope, which, in reality, had no chance of coming true. They were just her fantasies, her own imaginings. But even they helped her gather some additional courage and believe in herself. Gathering her courage once more, she climbed the steps to the porch and entered the house. The door slammed shut behind her. The entire yard, like the street, was enveloped in silence. It was the classic calm before the storm. "Where have you been all this time?" Luis's angry voice echoed in Irene's mind. She hadn't even reached the kitchen, where her husband, and quite possibly his crazy mother, were sitting, when she already heard the complaint directed at her. Despair engulfed her, the hopelessness that had been lurking inside her, waiting for the right moment to emerge, finally surfaced. At that very moment, as soon as she heard Luis's voice, she realized how deeply she was disappointed not only in him but in her life as a whole. After all, she had chosen this husband for herself. She had chosen to live with him and his mother under one roof. Ultimately, it was she who had initially chosen the strategy of not fighting back but loving to the end. Her own actions, decisions, and principles were ultimately destroying her, causing unbearable emotional suffering, and could potentially lead to a prolonged depression, a drinking problem, or something even worse. Removing her shoes and taking off her jacket, Irene walked into the kitchen with her head bowed. No matter how much she wanted to, no matter how hard she tried to resist her gentle nature and convince herself that she needed to stand up for herself, she couldn't face her fear head-on. At times like this, even her father's voice, like a personal guardian angel sent to her, didn't offer comfort. His important life lesson that, no matter how bad things got or how hopeless she felt, she still needed to get up and keep moving forward despite everything, didn't help her now. "I was at work," Irene said quietly, waiting for my replacement. "He was delayed for an hour and a half because his girlfriend suddenly ended up in the hospital and he had to go to her. There was nothing I could do, Luis. The circumstances were what they were." She still kept her head down, but could already feel the malevolent, enraged breath of her mother-in-law, who was likely sitting right next to her husband. Even without seeing him, Irene felt the piercing, hateful gaze from below, eyes boring into her from head to toe, digging into the most secret corners of her soul to finish her off completely. At work, the spiteful voice with a clear note of mockery came from Senora Alida, and the circumstances just happened. "Did you hear that, Luis?" "I heard, Mom," the man replied, "but please tell me, why can't circumstances ever work out in your favor? You've told me countless times that our whole life is in our hands, Irene. So why can't you take these damned circumstances into your own hands?" "Because it's my duty to wait for the shift change," the girl answered quietly. "I can't leave the store until my replacement, Fidel, arrives." And Fidel was delayed because his girlfriend. "We've already heard about that damn girlfriend," Senora Alida interrupted. "How much longer are you going to talk about her? Maybe you should explain why you couldn't call. Why didn't you give us a heads up that you were going to be late? Why do we have to sit and wait for you until midnight? We want to sleep too, dear." "Because she wasn't at the store at all," Luis shouted. "I know she's off with some other guys, not staying late at work. What's the point of her staying late at a 24-hour store if nobody comes in at night in our backwater? The damn workers are just sitting there, wasting time, while our Irene doesn't waste a minute. I know that for sure." At that moment, Irene finally gathered the courage to look up, meeting the eyes of her tormentors. At the center of the table sat a half-naked man with bleary eyes and dark circles beneath them, the result of his unhealthy lifestyle. Beside him, perched on a backless stool, was his mother, dressed in a robe, her gaze boring into every inch of Irene's body as if with a drill. Enduring verbal abuse was much easier than facing that scrutinizing stare. Unable to withstand it, the girl lowered her eyes to the floor again. "I'm starting to believe that too," Senora Alida said mysteriously. "As usual, it's the classic life scenario, Luis. Now she's running around with other men every night, and soon she'll start bringing those men here." "I'm not running around with other men," Irene suddenly exclaimed, but was immediately cut off by her mother-in-law. "Shut up, you fool. Do you even realize that your escapades are threatening the existence of your family? I trust my son more than I trust you. And if Luis believes that you're an unfaithful wife, then that's the way it is. His intuition has never let him down." "Intuition?" Irene asked, suddenly finding some courage. "What intuition?" "My intuition tells me that he's a damn mama's boy who hides under her skirt all the time. And my intuition also tells me that you're a damned panic-stricken and irresponsible mother since you've spoiled your son so much that at 30 he still lives with you and has no intention of moving out." Irene's voice echoed through the room, but after her last word, there was a profound silence in the house. Even the wind, which was blowing outside and could be heard through the windows, seemed to stop at that moment, ceasing to make any noise. The whole world seemed to hold its breath, like a frightened audience in a movie theater, waiting to see what would happen next. Irene raised her head. For malevolent eyes continued to stare at her, but neither Luis nor his mother moved at all. After a few seconds, which felt like a few hours, Luis and Senora Alida slowly turned to each other and then back to Irene. A few more seconds of silence. Eventually, it was broken by raucous laughter. Her husband and mother-in-law laughed maliciously, looking at the girl. They laughed so loudly that it seemed like their eardrums would burst, and the glass in the kitchen would start shattering. They pointed at her with their fingers, clutching their hearts and stomachs with the other hand. Gradually, their laughter began to drop in pitch, and it felt as if they had recorded their laughter and played it back at a very slow speed, with heavy distortion. Irene looked with a bewildered gaze at her family, who were laughing maliciously at her, and then, darkness. All-consuming, terrifying darkness, with no chance of escape, though there was one chance to escape it, and Irene took that chance. She opened her eyes. It was the same dream that had troubled her often. It had come to her again. The same wretched scene she had hoped never to see again. It had appeared to her when she had accidentally fallen asleep on the train. The sad music continued to play in her headphones, and outside the window it was still very dark, just as it was inside the train car. But there was no more rain. The droplets on the outside of the window that had been there when the train first departed from the station had already been blown away by the strong wind and the train's speed. Rubbing her eyes, Irene sleepily surveyed the dark train car. At first, she saw nothing, but she wanted to hope that the train had already stopped somewhere and that there were at least a few more people in her car. But there was no one. The car was completely empty. Apparently, the train had stopped at a station, but passengers had decreased rather than increased. She could risk moving to another car, but Irene decided she was fine staying here. There was no conductor, so she could move freely between the cars. With a hint of sorrow, she gazed once more at the endless darkness hiding between the trees and the forest corridor through which the train was currently passing. Perhaps it wasn't just a corridor, but a full-fledged forest, and somewhere deep within it, wild animals, foxes, bears, wolves, might have lurked, ready to maul her if she were left alone in the wild. But she thought that even being eaten by a wild animal would be a better outcome than leaving her life as it had been before she boarded the train. There were no streetlights, no infrastructure, no signs of life outside the window. Everything was as empty as her soul. Irene took out her phone to check the time. She still had 5 hours until her final destination. Yawning sleepily, she pressed her head against the window again and stared between the trees, somehow drifting back to sleep. Miraculously, she woke up 20 minutes before the train arrived at her station, where she was supposed to get off. Realizing this, she was incredibly relieved, as missing her stop would have been easy and straightforward, and she would have ended up traveling to an unknown destination. But she knew exactly where she was going. The gloomy morning was now outside the window. There was no rain, just gray clouds that didn't bring storms or downpours, obscuring the sky and preventing any sunbeams from piercing through. Irene liked this kind of weather. She nostalgically remembered how, as a child, she used to argue with her father about which weather was better. She must have been around 10 years old, or maybe even younger. Her father would lie on the couch in the living room, watching some political shows he adored, while little Irene, bursting with energy, would try to interrupt him and grab his attention. Every time there was a good opportunity, she would try to get her father's attention with some odd questions, to which he, by the rules of the game she had invented, was obligated to answer. Otherwise, he would lose the remote for 2 hours. "I don't know whatever possessed me," Irene recalled with a smile as the train sped through the morning forest. It was then that the question arose which Irene would probably remember for the rest of her life. Which is better, rain or sunshine? Little Irene asked her father. "Of course, sunshine," exclaimed her dad, trying to snatch the remote from her. "That's not true. Rain is better because when it's sunny, it's very hot, but when it's raining, it's cool outside, and it feels so nice to sit at home and look out the window." Irene still held the same opinion. She loved sitting by the window in rainy weather, watching as people hurried down the streets, quickly opening their umbrellas they had previously carried in their hands, or urgently pulling on the hoods of their jackets. Now she would have plenty of time to enjoy such sights. Even if there were no passers-by, no umbrellas, or hoods, there would be fresh air, clean nature, and a virtually untouched environment. There are few places like this left nowadays, but Irene had managed to find one. Soon, the girl got off the train and found herself at a bustling railway station. There were definitely more people here than in her hometown when she left, and now she could feel that she was not alone. No annoying ticket clerk would tell her she bought a ticket for the wrong train and poke her nose into other people's lives. Looking around, she once again felt her bag slipping off her shoulder. The slippery jacket prevented the strap from sitting firmly on her shoulder, so she had to support the bag from below with her hand, but in the midst of unfamiliar sensations, Irene had completely forgotten about it. She managed to catch the bag at the very last moment, just as it was about to fall onto the asphalt. Again, Irene had to bend sharply to grab the bag, and once more, this action caused a sharp pain in her back. Straightening up, Irene immediately saw in front of her a dark-skinned woman who had appeared out of nowhere, dressed in strange, multicolored woolen garments. The woman looked young, around 35, but her face, despite the youthful eyes and lips, was quite wrinkled. At first, Irene didn't understand what was happening. This woman, who was most likely a gypsy, looked at her with a detached gaze, or rather an inquisitive one. It was as if she was trying to read Irene's soul, and then, after a few seconds, fear, perhaps even terror, appeared on her face. "Why did you come here?" the gypsy woman asked. "Who are you running from?" Surprised, Irene wanted to twirl her finger at her temple but refrained from this impolite gesture. "What are you talking about?" she asked. "Who am I running from?" "You are running from someone," the gypsy woman said slowly, "from someone frightening. Are you afraid of him? Don't be afraid, no, he won't harm you anymore. And what you have left from him will bring you immense happiness. Not soon, no, you'll have to wait." She was probably referring to the baby still in Irene's womb. The baby she was carrying was not yet 3 months old, and her belly didn't protrude much. How did the gypsy know about it? Irene was overcome with a wave of goosebumps. "I see that great happiness awaits you. Very great." Surprisingly, the gypsy spoke without any accent. Her voice was slightly raspy, creating a persistent impression that she had been smoking the strongest tobacco available on the planet all her life. Perhaps that was indeed the case. After all, smoking is quite common among gypsies. This ancient nomadic people rarely denies themselves the pleasures of such unchanging and banal habits, which destroy health and, in the long run, life itself. The gypsy woman began to cough, covering her mouth with a fist. Irene continued to watch this dark-skinned stranger with great skepticism, but still felt that she could not completely disbelieve her. Somehow, the gypsy knew that Irene was pregnant, even though her belly was not yet visible through the autumn jacket. "What's your name?" In her fantasies, Irene had long since bid farewell to the gypsy, pretending that she found no truth in her words, turning around and going wherever she needed to go. But in reality, the only phrase that managed to escape from her lips was a question about the gypsy's name. "It doesn't matter," the gypsy replied. "It doesn't matter what my name is, since it won't give you any information, right? I see that you didn't come here by accident. I see that you're afraid of the new life you want to start. But you're not afraid of the beginning, you're more afraid of the gradual return to the life you're running from." Irene remained silent. She couldn't find the words to describe her feelings at that moment, no matter how hard she tried. She didn't believe in mysticism, divination, or anything similar. Every time in her hometown, elderly gypsies, of which there were many, extended their hands on the street asking for some money in exchange for telling her fortune, she would simply walk past them silently. But for some reason, here she couldn't just turn around and walk away, ignoring the situation. She wanted to keep listening to the dark-skinned woman. "I'm afraid," Irene admitted, and only then realized she had said it almost on her own. She hadn't intended to respond consciously, but the confirmation of the gypsy's words had come out of her mouth almost automatically. Irene was even a bit scared when she realized this, but the fear quickly faded as the gypsy began to speak again. "Don't be afraid," the gypsy said, peering as if into the very depths of the girl's soul. "The past life will never return to you. Rather, it will try to return, but you won't allow it. Your life, as you wish, begins anew. The stars and the sky are guiding you to the happiness you truly deserve. Your fate is now in the hands of forces that will prevent the return of the hell you've already endured. You've returned to your homeland, Irene." "Irene?" the girl thought, and her face reflected complete confusion and even a hint of fear. Irene did not understand how the fortune teller knew her name. Could it be that she had discerned something about her fate just by looking at her? She had heard that fate could be predicted by palm lines, but she had never heard that one's future could be predicted simply by looking at the person. The gypsy clearly possessed some supernatural powers that Irene could not comprehend. Then, the stranger slowly took a step back, nodded her head confidently, and then turned around and walked away, eventually disappearing into the crowd. Irene stood rooted to the spot, unable to understand or even process what had just happened. She could hardly move. Her hands and feet were numb, and all she could do was stand still and blink. The control over her body only returned a few moments later, when the fortune teller had vanished from sight, blending into the many people at the station. The stranger had indeed left Irene in a state of confusion that lasted throughout the day. The little house, as you can see, is quite small, of course, and it's lacking a good renovation, but unfortunately, we just can't afford it. The girl, who was as young as Irene herself, with a sad expression on her face, walked through the house, showing and explaining everything inside. Each room had its own story, which this girl eagerly shared, but every story almost brought tears to her eyes. "Why did you decide to sell it?" Irene asked, examining the peeling wallpaper in the living room. "The renovation here won't cost that much. The house itself isn't bad, and the place is quiet. And, as I understand, this house is a very valuable memory for you." "You know, Irene," Sandra, the girl selling the house, said with a sad face, "sometimes in a person's life, there comes a time when you just want to get rid of everything old. You want to step into a new life, with a new breath and completely free from memories of the past. Of course, this house is a very precious memory for me. I was born here and spent almost my entire life here. But these memories don't let me move forward. I want to move on, to do something else. But all I can do now is come back here, reread my childhood diaries, and remember the times when my parents were still alive. I miss them terribly, but I feel like I need to move forward. Perhaps if they were alive, they would want me to do just that." In every word from Sandra, Irene found echoes of her own story. It was akin to two twin sisters who had never known each other, meeting and starting to share their lives. And in the process, each was surprised at how similar their lives were. "I understand you," Irene nodded. "I understand you perfectly. But why are you selling it so cheaply? Parting with memories is always hard. You know, memories are not meant to be exploited. Memories are meant to be forgotten sooner or later, leaving only certain, especially pleasant moments in your mind. Besides, even if I had priced this house higher, I doubt anyone would have responded." The deal was completed the same day. In a bag, securely locked away, was a considerable sum of cash, which was calculated to be enough to purchase the small house. The money Irene used to buy her new home, which she planned to completely furnish to her taste over time, had been saved over several years. Sometimes she had to lie to her jealous husband about her salary being lower than it actually was. She didn't know why she had been saving this money. It was also a habit instilled in her by her now-deceased father from early childhood. From that age, the girl had strictly followed her father's life instructions, if they could be called that. And Irene never once had a hint of doubt that her father was advising her with anything but the best intentions. On the contrary, she had always admired how well prepared her father was for life and how he was now preparing his daughter. One could say that she was saving money for a rainy day. And that rainy day, as expected, eventually came, and it came. All the legal procedures for transferring the house's documents took a few more weeks. Grateful for the immense service, Sandra bid farewell to Irene and asked her to take good care of the house. Sandra had no doubt that the new owner of the old house would heed her request, because she had found something of a kindred spirit in Irene. They even occasionally corresponded afterward to check in on each other's lives. Irene quickly settled into her new home, located in a remote area outside the city, in a very small village with fewer than 1,000 residents. Nevertheless, it had everything needed for Irene's comfortable life. Nature, tranquility, and peace, These were the things she had longed for over the past few years. Gradually, she began tidying up the new house. The little house was indeed very small, but quite cozy. The renovation was old and unremarkable. Old furniture, including a wooden loft, filled the home and combined well with other vintage items, such as Persian rugs, some of which were hung on the walls. The only thing Irene didn't particularly like was that in the living room, the wallpaper was starting to peel away from the ceiling down to the floor, revealing some faded newspapers behind it. While tidying up the living room, Irene couldn't help but notice this. She stood on the sofa and tried to read what was written in the newspaper, but she couldn't make out any of the letters. Resolving to return to this issue sooner or later, perhaps to re-wallpaper and replace the furniture, she moved on to other tasks related to the house. Several weeks had passed since Irene moved into the house. One evening, while ironing clothes in the living room, she accidentally tugged on the iron, which had a rather short cord. Only a few seconds later did she realize she had done something quite bad. The iron refused to work anymore. After inspecting the cord, she discovered that the socket the iron was plugged into had been pulled out of the wall. "Please," she exclaimed nervously, sighing as she bent over the socket to assess the situation and figure out what to do. She didn't understand why the socket had come out, whether it was because the socket was too weak or because she had pulled too hard. Nonetheless, now exposed wires and some strange old electrical schematics, if they could be called that, were sticking out of the wall. Irene didn't know anything about electrical work, so she couldn't figure out what to do with the broken socket. Just as she was about to get up, she saw something that looked like a rolled-up piece of paper lying in the hole where the socket had once been. This find puzzled her. Why would anyone put paper inside a socket? Was the socket so weak that they had placed a paper pad in it? Despite her confusion, she was also intrigued. Irene quickly realized she needed to use something non-metallic to avoid touching the wires and risking an electric shock. The first thing that came to her mind was a simple plastic handle. She wasn't entirely sure, but her intuition told her that plastic should not conduct electricity. After some effort, Irene managed to pull the paper out of the hole. It was 2 standard-sized sheets folded in 4. One of the sheets was handwritten, and Irene immediately noticed that the handwriting was very small, even though she hadn't had a chance to really examine the paper yet. The other sheet was printed and decorative, which caught her attention a bit more. "Is this a will?" she wondered, reading what was written in large letters on the beautiful piece of paper. Confirming that it was indeed a will, legally drafted, Irene became immediately interested in the second sheet, which contained handwritten text. The entire sheet was filled with very fine but legible writing. Irene decided that it would be uncomfortable to read such a large note while on her knees, so she moved to a small, old sofa that barely held together, its backrest, armrests, and legs threatening to fall apart. Sitting comfortably, Irene began to read what was written on the note. "Dear Sandra, I know that one day you will find this note. Perhaps after the death of Mom and me, you will be renovating the house, and while changing the sockets, you will come across this sheet. Maybe it will be found by your man, who will do this for you. I cannot predict the circumstances under which this paper will end up in your hands, but I know for certain that sooner or later, you will find it. I cannot name the exact dates when Mom and I will be gone. Perhaps we will die on the same day, like in some romantic play or movie, or maybe fate will separate us in some other way. I'm sorry, I cannot know this. But what I do know is that after our deaths, you may become a little happier. If you first read the will, know that it is completely legal. I have an old friend, whom you know very well. His name is Senor Alberto, and he lives on the neighboring street. He may no longer be alive, but he has helped me greatly with this will, as at the time of writing this note, he is a lawyer. Well, I don't want to take up too much of your time, but I do need to explain a few things to you, daughter. What this will convey to you is something you have never seen before, something you never knew about and weren't supposed to know. Even though Mom and I tried all our lives to raise you as a diligent girl who would approach everything with a sense of responsibility, we could not know what you might have done if you had learned about this in advance. As they say, money corrupts people, and large amounts of money turn people into wild beasts. The sum that we want to pass on to you has been saved by us throughout our entire lives. Remember how we told you to always save money for a rainy day? Well, Mom and I followed that rule ourselves. We have saved an amount that will likely last you for the rest of your days. Yes, Sandra, we lived our lives almost in poverty, but Mom and I never lost hope that things would eventually turn around. We were in debt. We owed a huge amount to the bank. We were frightened by big men in leather jackets with bats on their shoulders, but we endured. We endured because we knew that you would have a rich and happy life ahead of you. For us, living it up is no longer meaningful. Mom and I are old and quite ill, so all our hope, Sandra, is on you. Mom and I believe that you won't disgrace our name. The times are different now. It is much easier to make something of yourself than it used to be. Your whole life is in your hands, daughter. Since we didn't get to live well, at least you should. Maybe this money will help you start a project you've been thinking about. It would be wonderful if that project became successful and you reached the heights you might be dreaming of. I am writing this letter on the day you graduated from school. I can hardly believe that these 10 years have passed so quickly. Although they are my 10 years as well. Every day you went to school in the morning, from the very first day of first grade to the very last day, I worried about you. I worried that you would get a bad grade that might spoil your mood. I worried that you would be bullied and not be able to stand up to your tormentors. I worried about the simple fact that something dangerous might happen to you, something that Mom and I would not be able to endure. But it's all good. You are now an adult, a well-aware young woman entering this adult life. I remember you wanted to study computers. I'm sure that computers are the future, so I'm not at all mistaken about the correctness of your choice. It's a very promising profession, programming. And may God grant that you succeed, Sandra. Daughter, remember, Mom and I have all our hope in you. We really hope that, even if you don't meet all our expectations, you will still be happy. After all, happiness is different for everyone, and Mom and I have no right to decide for you what you should want. We don't yet know how much Mom and I will have saved by the time we're gone, but even now, that amount is more than enough to live comfortably for almost your entire life. Yes, we could have afforded to build a luxurious mansion, which would have eventually passed on to you. But what's the point, daughter? Both Mom and I understand that you have a head on your shoulders, and you will surely achieve something in this life that is truly significant, rather than just acquiring luxurious mansions or expensive cars, which ultimately only serve to dazzle ordinary people. Mom and I really hope that you will become, if not great for everyone, then great for us. Don't let us down, Sandra. Mom and I believe in you. I'm writing this, and it saddens me deeply to think that sooner or later you will find this letter, as it would mean that our lives have ended and we will no longer be able to see you every day, knowing that we raised a truly diligent girl. We will no longer be able to watch over you or give you advice on how to handle various situations in life. We won't be able to simply be present with you, but know that as long as Mom and I live in your memory and your heart, we are alive in a sense. So if you're ever feeling down or sad, if life puts you in a situation where you find it hard to get out on your own, listen to your heart and know that it is the voice of our heart speaking to you. We will never leave you in trouble, daughter. After reading this heart-wrenching note, Irene felt a powerful wave of cold run down her spine. Tears had already gathered between her eyelids and were on the verge of spilling down her cheeks. The note left by the father of the previous owner of the house stirred emotions in Irene that she hadn't felt in a long time. The last time she felt such emotions was shortly after her parents' death, when she recalled pleasant moments associated with them. She remembered her childhood, especially how she used to play with her father, trying to distract him from the television with her silly but very amusing questions. She recalled how her mother taught her to cook, how they attended parent-teacher meetings together, and how, after one of them, little Irene was scolded for hiding her poor music grades. Turning the paper over, Irene saw that there was something written on the back as well, but the text was much shorter, fitting into about 1.5 lines in the same small handwriting as on the main page. After reading what was written, the girl discovered where Sandra's deceased parents had hidden an enormous sum of money, which, according to them, was intended to ensure Sandra's financial security and comfortable old age. It was evening, and November was approaching, so the wind howled outside continuously. According to the note, the money was hidden in an old, dilapidated shed where Sandra's father, as he had written, usually sharpened knives on his homemade sharpening machine. As it turned out later, the sharpening machine was nothing more than an ordinary washing machine monitor with a special sharpening disc attached to it. Putting on her coat and taking her phone to light the way, Irene stepped outside and immediately felt the full force of the late October wind. The old shed was about 15 meters from the house, so reaching it was not a problem. The only slight hindrance was that the path to it had overgrown with tall grass during the summer, and now, with the grass dried up, it tangled underfoot, creating a tripping hazard. Upon entering the shed, Irene quickly found the table with the sharpening machine. The shed was indeed very decrepit. The brick walls had long tilted, and grass had grown in some corners inside. Irene hurried over to the machine. As mentioned in the note, the money was stored near it in a very unremarkable small box that should be hidden somewhere on the table. The box, as described, was white and cardboard. Irene began rummaging through the table in search of the box. She wanted to find it quickly to confirm whether the note was truthful or not. Perhaps Sandra had already found the box, and there was no point in searching anymore, but it was only a guess. She needed to double-check. Then the flashlight beam fell on a small box that was lying far off, not in the most conspicuous place. It was hidden between a wall and a larger box containing many nails, screws, dowels, metal brackets, and other very useful items. Grabbing the box, Irene moved it closer and tried to open it, but she couldn't. It turned out that the box was taped shut, so she first needed to cut through the tape. Perhaps one of Sandra's parents had died first, and after the death of one parent, there was no point in saving money any longer. For some reason, this was the first thought that came to Irene's mind, but she didn't dwell on it too much. Right now, the most important thing was to verify the presence of the money, and later she could speculate on why the box was sealed with tape. Holding the precious box in her free hand, Irene hurried to leave the shed and return to the warmth of the house. To a place where the cold late October wind didn't blow, where there were no endless cobwebs, and where there was no dust. Upon reaching the house, she locked the door from the inside. Quickly removing her shoes and jacket, she briskly entered the kitchen, took a knife, and cut through the tape. It was time to open the box. Irene prepared herself, gathered her courage, and opened the lid. What she saw inside truly shocked her. The box contained several thick bundles of banknotes wrapped in rubber bands. There was indeed a lot of money, and Irene realized that this amount could ensure a comfortable life well into old age. Closing her eyes, Irene began to dream about how she could use this money to live comfortably, raise a daughter who would lack for nothing, and simply wake up every day with the confidence that there would be something to eat in the refrigerator. But that was wrong. Irene didn't intend to take someone else's money, but nothing stopped her from simply dreaming. Opening her eyes and glancing at the box of money once more, she picked up the phone that was lying on the table and immediately dialed Sandra's number. She hoped that the former owner of the house would pick up quickly. And she did. Sandra answered the phone without making Irene wait too long. "Hello," Irene exclaimed as soon as the ringing stopped. "Hello, Sandra. I have some news for you, but I don't know how you'll take it." "Hi, Irene," Sandra replied, sounding puzzled. "What's the news at 9 o'clock in the evening? Did something happen? Did you find something?" "I did, and it's quite significant. Do you have a chance to come over right now?" "I hope so." "Sandra, honestly, this is a very important matter that requires immediate attention. You need to come over. You just have to come right now." "All right." "Okay," the former owner of the house replied, still puzzled, with a slight hint of apprehension in her voice that Irene could detect. "I'll be there in 40 minutes. Wait for me." "Okay, I'll wait," Irene replied and hung up. When Sandra arrived, she called Irene, who then opened the gate for her. As soon as Sandra stepped inside, Irene practically threw herself around her new acquaintance's neck, trying to convey a sense of intrigue. For all of Sandra's questions, Irene responded that she would be able to see everything for herself soon. The only thing she had warned Sandra about in advance was that Sandra might become very distressed and burst into tears, but it would probably be worth it. Once inside the house, Irene immediately led Sandra to the living room where the two notes were lying. "Now listen," Irene said, seating Sandra on the couch. "I was ironing clothes, and the iron had a very short cord. I don't know how it happened, but I accidentally yanked the iron, and the socket literally fell out of the wall. You can see for yourself." "I see," Sandra nodded. "And what does that mean? That the sockets in the house aren't very good?" "Yes, I know, but I did warn you about that when you moved in, so." "It's not about that, Sandra," Irene exclaimed. "I'm sorry for initially meddling in something that wasn't my business when I checked what I found in the socket. You might not understand me at all right now, but you will soon. Here." She handed Sandra the first sheet of paper, the will. "You can read this." Sandra read the will silently, not quite understanding what it was about. The writing was vague, and the phrasing was somewhat unclear. The document stated that she was to inherit a certain amount of money, but no specific figures were mentioned. "So what?" Sandra asked in surprise, returning the will. "This is a will, as I understand it. The house was passed on to me by will, yes, but no mention of money." "And now, please, be patient," Irene interrupted. "You're probably going to find it very hard to read this. If I was moved to tears, and I'm someone who's not involved in your situation at all, then you might be very upset. Here. If you need water or something to calm down, I have some. Just let me know." Sandra cautiously took the handwritten note in her hands and began to read it carefully. It took her about 5 minutes to read it, but by the second minute, tears were already streaming from her eyes. Sandra was wearing makeup, so the tears smeared the mascara across her cheeks. After finishing the note, she quickly handed it back to Irene, abruptly stood up from the couch, and moved closer to the window. Leaning her palms on the windowsill, she stood silently and gazed out at the dark yard. "Do you want me to get you some water?" Irene asked with concern. "If you need anything, please let me know, Sandra. This all started because of me, and if it weren't for me, you would never have found out about this and wouldn't be so upset." "I'm fine," Sandra replied, barely holding back tears. "Don't worry about me, it's just emotions, Irene. Sad feelings. So, what about the amount of money? You didn't read the back of the note, where it said where the money was hidden." "I went there and took the box. I swear to you, I didn't take anything from it. You'll see for yourself when you check the box. The money inside is covered in a thick layer of dust." Irene led Sandra to the kitchen, where she looked at the money left by her parents. Seeing it, Sandra broke down even more. She threw herself around Irene's neck, and Irene happily embraced her new friend. She sympathized with Sandra, but, to be honest, she also felt a little envious, though in a good way, not out of selfishness. As expected, Sandra took the money her parents had left her. She shared that she had often joked with her father about wanting to become some kind of inventor or discoverer whose invention would turn the world upside down. She had said this entirely in jest, but her father saw a small kernel of truth in every joke. Perhaps that's why he wrote what he did in the note. In a gesture of immense gratitude, Sandra shared a substantial portion of the money with Irene. She said she was incredibly grateful for Irene not hiding the information and for telling her everything as promised, and for not taking anything from the box herself. Sandra admitted that she had rarely met such honest and kind people as Irene in her life, and even said she wished she had such a best friend. Irene took this as a call to action rather than empty words, and immediately realized that she saw a kindred spirit in Sandra as well. With the money Sandra had given her, Irene did a major renovation on the house. She searched online and found a team of workers who promised to complete the renovation quickly and to a high standard. The reviews on their website were positive, so Irene decided to use their services. She wasn't disappointed, and within a couple of weeks, the small, once crumbling house had been transformed into a beautiful and modern living space. Time passed. Irene's pregnancy was approaching its end. During the nearly 6 months she had lived in the new house, her ex-husband had tried to reach her several times. He sent her messages saying that he had finally had a change of heart, that he had decided to choose her over his mother, and that he was ready to change for her. He wrote that he missed her terribly and had only now realized that he loved her more than anything in the world after losing her. But Irene was little concerned with the messages from the man who had helped her start a new life. By that time, she had also caught the attention of a young man who seemed to feel the same way about her. His name was Samuel, and he knew perfectly well that Irene was about to give birth. This didn't bother him at all. Samuel was very responsible, a fact evident not from his words, but from his actions and deeds. He was a very decent and good person with a conscience as honest as Irene's. In short, they were a great match for each other. Right before the birth, when Irene was about to have the baby girl they planned to name Marina, Samuel promised that he would treat her as his own daughter. At that moment, Irene realized that she had made the right decision to start a new life from scratch. For on this new page, there would be no more stains.
If you're enjoying it as well, leave a like and subscribe to the channel.